Hello and welcome back to the Münster podcast. I'm your host, as always, Charles, and I'm going to go as quick as I can into the contents of this episode because I initially recorded everything I'm about to cover in this episode about, 4 or 5 hours ago. I just finished watching a football game right now. Unfortunately, as soon as I was done recording that episode, my recording software crashed and I lost everything that I just recorded, which was a shame because I really enjoyed making that episode and I thought it was quite good. So hopefully I can do as good as a job as I did back then. And well, there you go. You probably don't care anymore, so let's just get straight into it. So we're going to cover, roughly around 3 topics today. Very quickly as soon as what am I even doing right now? Ethiopian civil war, the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, and then we'll touch on something a little bit close to home, the future of Jeremy Corbyn. So let's get straight into the Ethiopian situation. So for those of you who haven't been keeping up on the news in Eastern Africa, Ethiopia is on the brink of a civil war. Now this is mainly between the two forces, the Ethiopian government and the Tigray Tigray People's Liberation Front. That is what they're called. I don't know why I just forgot what they were called. Sorry about that. Tigray People's Liberation Front, which is a Tigray nationalistic sort of left-wing militia. They're a militia, but they're also a political group. They have many different forms, but they're based in northern Ethiopia in the mountains where the Tigrays live. So conflict has started between them. It's escalated to a point where many critics are now saying that Ethiopia is about to enter a civil war, and the way that things are escalating, it genuinely seems to be the case. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Tigrays are an ethnic minority. They're mainly Orthodox Christians and some are Muslims that live in northern Ethiopia, and the Tigray People's Liberation Front is a political group and sort of a rebel group that has existed for a very long time in Ethiopia. They were active during the Ethiopian Civil War in the 1980s and 1990s, in which, along with other rebel groups, particularly Eritrean rebel groups, they helped get rid of the communist military junta that was in charge. Now, whilst the Tigray People Liberation Front, as implied by their name, are historically Marxist, nowadays they're a bit more moderate. They're usually just kind of socialist kind of group, but they oppose the military dictatorship in Ethiopia, not necessarily the communist ideology behind it. Now, conflict is starting again, and it's going to be interesting, to say the least. The Tigrays insist that they will fight it out in the mountains to the north of the country. It's a very mountainous area in the north of Ethiopia, and they definitely have the manpower to do it, or so they claim, because whilst the Tigrays are not as big as they used to be, politically they're still very strong, and also they claim to be able to recruit up to 200,000 men. They also claim that they will fight a guerrilla war, which nobody likes fighting against, really. A guerrilla war inside the mountains in the north of the country, and claim that they'll be able to get a lot of popular support, which, as we've seen in history before, guerrilla wars tend to garner that kind of support. The Ethiopian government, meanwhile, they have, a conventional army. They have, helicopter gunships and attack jets and things, so the Tigrays are really going to be at a disadvantage there. But once again, guerrilla warfare seriously circumvents a lot of the advantages the federal government could have. But yeah, so it's starting to escalate. The Ethiopian Prime Minister, or President, I think it's President, over the last 2 or 3 years has been purging Tigrays from the government. When the Tigrays and the other rebel groups deposed the military dictatorship in the 1980s and 1990s, the Tigrays got a considerable amount of control of the military and the government. There's a lot of Tigrays in high-up positions in Ethiopia. Now, a lot of that progress was getting reversed by the various leaders in Ethiopia in the last sort of 2 or 3 years, and as a result that's caused a lot of tension. Now, the Tigray People's Liberation Front is now kind of threatening this war, and the government has responded by also threatening war. So it appears that both sides are completely ready to throw men into this and sort of settle this fight once and for all, because this kind of conflict between the Tigrays and the militia groups and then the government, the central government, was kind of brewing ever since the end of the Ethiopian civil war. This almost seemed like an inevitable sort of product and outcome of the previous war, which in such an unstable area of the world, these kind of conflicts seem inevitable until one power seriously consolidates everything and sort of squeezes their grip over the politics of the country, which the Ethiopians were not able to do after the civil war. Really, there was still plenty of unrest, loads of conflicts with its neighbours, independence wars, Eritrea, all that stuff happening. So it is to probably nobody's surprise that this is escalating so much. Now, what will this mean for the neighbours of Ethiopia? Probably a lot of strained relationships. So Eritrea will likely be very sympathetic to the rebels, as obviously Eritrea broke free from Ethiopia in the 1980s and 1990s. They fought in the Ethiopian Civil War to try to get their independence. But also, we've got to consider the amount of refugees that are pouring out of Ethiopia right now. They're very much anticipating the conflict, and the conflict has started in some localized areas. And hundreds of refugees are leaving Ethiopia, going to places like South Sudan, and it's getting very alarming. There is a crisis currently growing in the Horn of Africa. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens there. This has been developing for the last month or so on this scale, but the larger long-term effects have been brewing, ever since the 1980s. So this is largely a continuation of that. So keep your eyes peeled on the news about Ethiopia. Things are about to heat up very quickly. We'll move on to the next section that I want to talk about, which is Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, I did talk about these in a Q&A. The video is just called Q&A with Charles number 2. It's the first episode of season 2 of the Münster podcast. Please go have a look at that for my opinions at the time of that video, which was about a month ago. Things have changed a lot since that video. There has been a sort of formal peace treaty that was mediated by the Turks and the Russians, and there are some winners to this and there are some losers to this. Let's start with the losers. Obvious one being Armenia. They, unfortunately for them, lost the conflict and they had to concede the Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous region to the Azerbaijani government, who during the conflict managed to reoccupy that region. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Nagorno-Karabakh region is an area that is inside Azerbaijani borders, but is populated almost entirely by ethnic Armenians, and as a result, the Armenian government occupies it militarily and controls it, basically. So it's de jure controlled by Azerbaijan, but de facto controlled by Armenia, if that makes any sense for you. So the Azerbaijanis are very happy to get that back. Armenians living inside the area are quite terrified, to be frank. So it's going to be really interesting what happens in that region. Some areas surrounding it too. Russia has been awarded certain areas to militarily occupy for quote-unquote peacekeeping. Now, we'll see what they'll actually do. Very likely what they're using that is just a forward operating base for operations inside the Middle East and also Caucasia in the future. That is basically what they're doing. So they're getting involved in these areas to expand their sphere of influence. Speaking of spheres of influence, Turkey's sphere of influence, they had probably anticipated it to be a lot larger than what they got, but in the end they only got a small area to quote-unquote peacekeep, very similar to what Russia received, but not on the same extent. Russia was actually given a very generous amount of land to peacekeep, especially in comparison to Turkey. Now, Turkey probably got the raw end of the deal, excluding Armenia, but Turkey probably got the raw end of the deal because they very much want to expand their sphere of influence to try counteract the growing Russian sphere of influence. Now, obviously Russia's sphere of influence was always going to be huge in the region anyway, but with the rise of President Erdogan and the kind of reinvigoration of Islamic nationalism and this, almost pseudo-fascism in Turkey, they definitely want to be expanding their sphere of influence as they have been doing in areas like Syria and Libya. Now, this was a perfect opportunity for Turkey to capitalize on that, but unfortunately for them, Russia's sort of influence in that region is just too great, and this is mainly because Russia as a country was always going to have incredible influence, but secondly, also because Russia had previously been involved in that area before. In the 1990s, when Armenia and Azerbaijan also had a war for the similar reasons, Russia mediated that peace treaty too, so it's just unlucky for Turkey, really. Another surprising winner and loser is Israel and Iran. Now, Iran, a long-term ally of Russia, you would think that Russia benefiting from this war would also benefit Iran, but actually the Iranian government is very concerned about the consequences of this peace treaty in relation to Israel, probably every Muslim country's biggest enemy. And the reason for this is the sort of reoccupation of Nagorno-Karabakh actually expands the border between Azerbaijan and Iran. Now, the reason this is a concern for Iran is because Iran actually regularly accuses Azerbaijan of being very close friends with Israel and very close friends with the Israeli Foreign Intelligence Agency. Now, for those of you that have been following the news in Iran, a few days ago, the top Iranian nuclear scientist was assassinated, and all fingers point towards Israel. So this peace treaty was done at the start of November, and I'm currently recording this towards the end of November, so we could genuinely just be seeing one of the consequences of the treaty, which is allowing more Israeli agents into the country, allowing more intelligence to be spread, because allegedly, according to Iran, Azerbaijan and Israel work very closely in terms of diplomacy, economics, but mainly the spy networks is what they were concerned about, and we could be seeing one of the consequences here. The assassination could have just been by like the CIA or something, or it could have be from the government itself. What if the scientist was actually dissenting? We don't know, but it could possibly just be Mossad. So there you go. So those are the kind of consequences of the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. Armenia, the reaction in Armenia was a lot of distrust towards the government. Now, the Prime Minister of Armenia was actually fairly popular with the people until he signed that peace treaty. The people in Armenia actually rioted and they stormed the parliament and occupied it in protest because they wanted to really continue the war. Speaking of continuing the war, in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, ethnic Armenians living there and Armenians still trapped there have kind of vowed to defend that region until the last man. And whilst the rest of the Armenian army has withdrawn, demobilized and surrendered, the forces still in the Nagorno-Karabakh region have vowed to continue the good fight. The Azerbaijani troops have been, in Baku, there have been many celebrations over the victory in the war, because Armenia is one of their biggest historical enemies. But Baku has also sworn to investigate war crimes committed by Azerbaijani troops. Now, I don't know if I mentioned this in the previous episode where I talked about this conflict, but there have been videos circulating online of Armenian soldiers being executed, Armenian soldiers getting their heads cut off, their ears cut off, plenty of videos of Azerbaijani soldiers playing football with Armenian soldiers, decapitated heads. It's all rather horrifying, and these are all war crimes that definitely have to be investigated into. There also been allegations of, in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, Azerbaijani troops opening fire on civilians, firing missiles at civilians, artillery, mortars, all that lovely stuff right there. Baku has said that they will investigate this. Whether or not they actually will, I highly doubt they will, because usually countries don't, prosecute their own men. It's very uncommon in history to see that. But yeah, those are the possible consequences for those soldiers. These war crimes have been widespread, by the way. This isn't just a few places. This is something that has been happening a lot. And as a result, it will be very interesting to see how they handle that and what the reaction will be abroad. I've not particularly seen a lot of reaction, actually, from many Western countries in relation to this conflict. So, is this perhaps another conflict where innocent people die and are getting stuffed? under the rug? I'm not entirely sure. So there we go. There are my thoughts on the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, and we'll move on to something perhaps a little bit more lighthearted, but it's definitely closer to home. Jeremy Corbyn. What has happened to you? He has had a huge fall from grace in the last year or so. Not necessarily his fault. So he's been basically kicked out of the Labour Party. He is still a member of the Labour Party, but his powers as an MP have been stripped drastically, and unfortunately his political career is more or less over, which is, for the Corbyn supporters, unfortunate, but for the rest of Labour, is great. Keir Starmer is going to use this as a springboard to rebuild the Labour Party and get the support back that the Labour Party really needs to actually contest the Conservative Party. Now, a lot of the hate towards Corbyn was mainly aimed at his personal views. The allegations of anti-Semitism, let's be 100% honest, are somewhat tame in comparison to something that Boris Johnson may have done. It's definitely less explicit, but it's definitely also a massive problem for Jewish Labour voters. Because the signs of anti-Semitism, you know, if you do look at it, it is slightly concerning, but whether it has been blown out of proportion or not is, you know, genuinely completely up to your opinion. In my opinion, I think it has been blown somewhat out of proportion, but I don't actually think that Starmer and the rest of the moderates are actually removing Corbyn from his position because of anti-Semitism. They're merely using that as an excuse to remove him. What they are removing him from is because of his potentially polarising and alienating views that have set Labour back in the last 5 years or so. Labour's opposition has been relatively weak, and a good Labour leader would have been able to work upon these mistakes and hopefully convincingly win an election. I mean, one of their opposition, you know, one of the leaders of the Conservative Party at the time whilst Corbyn was leader was Theresa May, a completely incompetent Conservative MP, let alone Conservative leader. And Corbyn's failure to capitalise on that opportunity is really telling of not only the lack of support that Corbyn had from his own party, but potentially weaknesses in Corbyn's leadership too. The media has a huge part to play on this too. Many people accuse the media of being unfair towards Corbyn and presenting his anti-Semitic, potentially anti-Semitic views, you know, blowing it way out of proportion. Again, that's completely up to your opinion. In my opinion, I think it has been blown out of proportion, but that does not necessarily mean that he's immune from criticism before. Definitely a lot of question marks about Corbyn's ability as a leader to actually rally the Labour Party. Starmer is probably looking to seize this opportunity and really rally the Labour Party and let the moderates who would have potentially voted Labour back into the party and say, look, Corbyn, this quote-unquote communist, is no longer in charge. You've got me now. I'm a lot more moderate. I'm a lot more professional. I'm not as, you know, scruffy almost. I can genuinely resonate and speak with you. Okay. This will get a lot of the middle class vote back. This will also get a decent amount of the working class, more patriotic vote back too, which is one of the large reasons why Corbyn failed as a leader, actually. Sort of, you know, contrary to possibly what we may have believed, actually. So Starmer will be looking to seize and capitalise on this opportunity, and really, the sky's the limit for Starmer now. This lockdown and this pandemic has really given Keir Starmer a very good opportunity to show the weaknesses in the Conservative Party. Not only is Boris Johnson and his party, you know, getting very exhausted from the pandemic and they're losing a lot of faith in the people, but Starmer himself is able to manipulate that and expose even more weaknesses. I mean, Boris Johnson gets spun in PMQs by Keir Starmer. Like, it's actually kind of astonishing considering how well Boris Johnson is able to compose himself and announce himself in Parliament, really. He's getting spun by Keir Starmer, who up until this point had been kind of a nobody, really. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens there. Can Corbyn jump back from this and reignite his political career? Probably not. I think it's over. It's probably the end of the road here for Corbyn. His track record as a Labour leader was unfortunately not very fruitful, and for Labour, the gamble to have a slightly more left-wing Labour leader didn't really pay off, no matter how charismatic he was. Unfortunately, it just didn't pay off, and now Labour, who were stuck in the mud, now have Keir Starmer, who they are going all in on now, really, to make sure that he can lead Labour to a better position. Hence the massive support that he's getting, and hence the massive support against Jeremy Corbyn's presence in the Labour Party. I think that just shows how tight of a reign Starmer has over the Labour Party. We could potentially see a rebellion from supporters of Corbyn, but the problem is that they'll likely be ousted too, because I think Starmer's position as a moderate Labour MP is just too strong, and election patterns and such will probably help back his position up. So there you go, my opinion on Ethiopia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and finally Jeremy Corbyn's sort of exit towards politics. I mean, it's a very ungraceful exit, unfortunately, for what I think was a very decent politician. But there we go, you can't please everybody, and such is the kind of wave of politics, really. That's just how people go in and out. Not everybody has a happy ending. There you go. Margaret Thatcher is a very good example of that. And Winston Churchill too. Not everybody has a happy ending. So there you go. There are my opinions on those topics. Thank you very much for listening to the Münster podcast. I was your host, Charles. If you have any feedback or would like to voice your own opinions on what I've just talked about, please leave it down in the comments down below. And if you want to support this channel, please like and subscribe. It would mean a lot, because I love making these videos and I love this channel, and overall it's just a great amount of fun. This was the Münster podcast. I am Charles, and I'll catch you next time.